Speaking of the green agenda, there's another agenda also run by the eco-zealots, which is the war on the motorist. And make no mistake, driving an electric car will not see you exempt from this tyranny. One man who knows this all too well is former London mayoral candidate Zac Goldsmith, who has now been banned from driving for a whole year after 11 trivial speeding offences. And while I obviously don't advocate speeding, some of these offences were patently absurd, such as when he drove at 28 miles an hour in a 20 zone and 48 in a 40. But what's even more bizarre is the pompous, puffed-up magistrate cared to mention that motorists who break speed limits emitted more harmful emissions, even in hybrid and electric cars, as if that had anything to do with the matter. Well, I'm joined now by my most cerebral panel, Emma Webb and Michael Craig. Michael.
Mocking the judiciary.
I'm pompous magistrate. And if I were in the House of Commons, I wouldn't be allowed to, but I'm allowed to when I'm not in the Commons. What seems to be so fundamentally unfair is that the system of catching motorists has changed, but the penalties haven't. So there's been a massive increase in the number of penalties issued. When this point system started, it was that you had to be pulled over by a policeman. And policemen only pulled you over if you'd done something pretty silly. So the chance of getting 12 points in 3 years meant you were quite a bad, irresponsible driver. Now, just sort of pootling along a little bit above the limit, poor Zac got caught in temporary speed limits, which are a monstrosity. And then suddenly you find you've lost your licence for a year, which is a huge imposition. It's just not fair.
Well, you described the offences as trivial, but the one you just mentioned, him being done at 28 miles an hour when the limit is 20, that is more than, it's 40% above the limit. That is not trivial.
But 20 is a silly limit.
Well, I think if you were hit by a car driving at 20 miles an hour, you might survive. If you were hit by a car driving at 28 miles an hour, you probably wouldn't. So safety concerns.
But that's a very good argument for 20 outside a school. It's a terrible argument for safety for 20 on the Cromwell Road, which is just to annoy the motorist by the Mayor of London.
Well, I think that overall, lower limits, because after all, if your electric cars are seen to be exempt and so it gets so complicated, I do think 20-mile-an-hour limits are a good idea on the whole.
So Michael Crick wants us to go back to having red flag in front of your car. Typical socialist, he wants the red flag out. Emma, this is really a war on the motorist, and it's become too onerous, and losing your licence for relatively trivial offences is surely disproportionate.
We've just been talking about net zero, and I think motorists do feel that they are besieged on all sides. There are so many ways in which motorists are being caught out and tripped up, and that actually it's not entirely reasonable. Now, of course, you shouldn't speed. That's fair enough. Nobody's advocating for that. But what you need is a reasonable application of the law. You need common sense to rule the day, essentially. And I think that motorists will feel, and I think quite rightly, that they are being targeted because particularly with ULEZ is one example of this, but there are other measures that have recently been brought in. There is also the recent news of private companies that have been issuing 35,000, I think it is, 35,000, I think that's the correct number, parking tickets a day, costing people billions.
Well, it makes a lot of money for the DVLA. But we can move on to more of that subject because the powers of councils have been expanded. So as many as 10 million households now face the tyranny of more fines for traffic offences, very minor ones. 85 highway authorities will now have the powers to fine motorists if they're caught stopping in yellow boxes or making illegal U-turns and such other trivial misdemeanours. There seems to be yet another case of more proof that the war on the motorist is merely a money-making scheme, especially considering many of our councils are practically bankrupt and desperate for more of your money. Well, Emma, do you want to continue on that point?
Well, I think that it perfectly illustrates that it's mounting that, as I said, I described it as motorists feeling as if they're besieged on all sides. Now, I can't drive. I will at some point learn to drive. But I'm sure that there'll be many people in my position who will feel dissuaded. And I think that that's what the intention is. ULEZ is a good example of this. Low traffic neighbourhoods are another example. And particularly if you need to drive for your trade, all of the restrictions and incentives and disincentives towards electric vehicles. This is adding extra costs for people, particularly tradesmen or taxi drivers. People feel as if, drivers, I believe, feel as if they are being persecuted. And I think it's wrong because the people who are affected most by this are working class people.
Well, I do think we need to do more to get people out of their cars and onto public transport. And I mean, I've been done for yellow boxes. They're blooming impossible to understand, and you get stuck and all of that, and it feels unjust. And the fact that the money goes to the council and our councils are stretched is sort of a compensation. But people are driving cars that are a lot bigger than they were only 20 years ago. We need to get people out of their cars onto buses and onto trains.
They like going in cars.
Well, because we need to achieve net zero.
What are you going to do in North East Somerset, in my constituency?
Well,
it's impractical.
Well, I'm not saying that obviously you do it much more in London, which is what we're talking about here, and less in rural areas.
Isn't there a fundamental...
And of course, with the decline of our bus system, that doesn't help.
But isn't there a fundamental principle of justice? You say it feels unfair, that as a motorist, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and that turns justice on its head.
Well, it is. But you can imagine what the legal system would be like if it was the other way round.
Oh, but that's a terrible argument.
I know it is, but
you can't be unjust for the sake of convenience.
What are you saying? That we don't punish people at all for any of these offences?
No, if it's
not, then people would ignore the offences.
No, but you don't treat motorists like they're a piggy bank, and that's what's happening. And you can say, oh, the reason why we should do this is because of net zero, but that's just ideology. That's just an ideological point. You're using net zero as if it's an axiom.
I think actually, at times when our councils are falling apart and can't do basic... Sorry?
That's because they're incompetent.
It's not because they're incompetent. Most councils are more competent than the government that you used to belong to. They're more competent than central government. And
wildly inefficient in their use of public money.
Before we finish, I'm going to get one point before we finish.
Yeah.
And that is that if the offence is worth prosecuting through the courts, it's worth prosecuting. If it's not worth prosecuting through the courts, it's not worth prosecuting. And that's the fundamental inversion of our justice system.
Well, I agree that's not satisfactory.
We've got agreement from Michael for at least half a second.
You cut me off.
I cheated.
Isn't this what you started with? Trump being taken, what you say, out of context.
All right, sorry, I've taken Michael out of context.